Today at 6, the actor Sidney Poitier, whose pioneering films in the 50s and 60s shone a light on racism and social prejudice, has died. He was 94.
You will call me Sir or Mr. Thackeray.
He was the first black man to win an Oscar with his groundbreaking work, paving the way for generations of black artists. He received a knighthood in 1974. We'll be reflecting on his impact on Hollywood and civil rights, also on the programme. The effects of COVID on NHS workers. Staff absence was up by 41% in England after Christmas.
I think we have to be honest, and when we look at the NHS, it will be a rocky few weeks ahead.
The hotel where Novak Djokovic remains in detention in Australia, he thanks his fans for their support. The aftermath of days of unrest in Kazakhstan, security forces are ordered to shoot to kill protesters. And the letter that reached its destination without a surname or address.
And coming up on the BBC News channel, Johnny Bairstow hits a century as England finds some salvation in Sydney to end day 3 of the 4th Ashes Test, trailing Australia by 158 runs.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The actor Sidney Poitier, whose groundbreaking films in the 1950s and 60s shone a light on racism and social prejudice, has died. He was 94. He was the first black man to win an Oscar for Best Actor, and his groundbreaking work paved the way for generations of other black artists. His films, including To Sir with Love, In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, reflected an America struggling with issues of racism and prejudice at the height of the civil rights movement. His impact ultimately transcended the silver screen. Our correspondent Lizo Mazimba looks back on the life of a Hollywood icon.
In the heat of the night.
Sidney Poitier's Virgil Tibbs, a man of authority.
I'm a police officer.
Intelligence and a steely determination never to back down. The kind of qualities that defined Poitier on screen and off.
Dr. Smith.
He made his cinema debut playing a doctor, a man of status, something almost unheard of for black performers then. And with roles like an escaped convict in The Defiant Ones and a struggling husband in A Raisin in the Sun, he tackled prejudice head-on.
Maybe I'll get down on my black knees. All right, Mr. Charlie. All right, Mr. Great White Father. You just give us that money, and we won't come out there and dirty up your white folks' neighborhood.
The era, of course, meant he had a burden his white counterparts rarely had to carry, the weight of being a symbol. But he bore it with dignity. In Lilies of the Field, playing a travelling handyman, helping build a group of nuns a new chapel.
Sing it over.
The winner is Sidney Poitier.
He won the Academy Award, the first black performer ever to receive the Oscar for a leading role. In the years that followed, he became Hollywood's biggest star, redefining how audiences saw black characters, with films like To Sir with Love.
You will call me Sir or Mr. Thackeray. The young ladies will be addressed as Miss, the boys by their surnames.
Some of what I am was reflected in those movies. And on top of that, I brought to it some of my values. So it was, in a way, I was saying to an audience, this is who I am. Look at me.
More controversial was his role as a highly gifted, hugely successful doctor engaged to a white woman in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner.
I love your daughter. There is nothing I wouldn't do to try to keep her as happy as she was the day I met her.
Some criticised it, saying the impression it gave was of an interracial relationship that was only acceptable because his character was so perfect and accomplished. It was still a huge box office hit.
Hello.
He also directed 80s comedy Stir Crazy, the first movie from an African-American filmmaker to pass the blockbuster $100 million mark in the United States.
What are you doing?
I'm getting bad.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sidney Poitier.
And when he was well into his 80s, an honorary Oscar Hollywood recognition for a star who blazed a trail for so many.
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
And who entertained millions more. Sidney Poitier, one of the greats.
Sidney Poitier, who's died at the age of 94. Well, in the last few minutes, there have been numerous tributes. The Oscar-winning actress Viola Davis said, "No words can describe how your work radically affected my life. Your role showed that black folks mattered." And Oprah Winfrey wrote, "For me, the greatest of the great trees has fallen. My honor to have loved him, a mentor, friend, brother." Well, our correspondent Sophie Long is in Hollywood for us this evening. Sophie, it is an important point to make, isn't it? His work was trailblazing on the screen, but his impact on American culture transcended cinema.
That's right, Clive. Not only was he a trailblazing actor with a landmark career full of acting, directing and producing roles, but he was well aware of the power and the responsibility that came with his fame and fortune. He reportedly once said he felt as if he were representing 18 million people with every move he made. Now, he may not have chosen to represent all black men, but as the sole black leading man in Hollywood of his time, that ultimately became one of his most important roles. He played a role, a huge voice for the civil rights movement, and played a role in organising the March in Washington in 1964, where Dr. Martin Luther King made his "I Have a Dream" speech. Before his assassination, the icon said of Sidney Poitier, "He is a man of great depth, a man of great social concern, and a man who's dedicated to human rights and freedom." And that really reflected the tributes that are pouring in for him in Hollywood this morning. He was, Clive, a true Hollywood legend.
Sophie, thank you. Sophie Long, they're live in Hollywood. Now, there's been a sharp rise in staff absences at NHS hospitals in England caused by health workers contracting COVID. Now, they were up by 41% in the week after Christmas compared to the previous 7 days. That's more than 35,500 workers off with COVID-related sickness on average every day. And around 4% of staff at acute NHS trusts in England were off due to COVID each day during the week ending the 2nd of January. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid has warned the NHS is facing a rocky few weeks ahead. Our health editor Hugh Pym has more.
Reinforcements for the NHS front line. Military personnel arriving at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. The armed forces are also supporting hospitals in other parts of the UK, including London and the northwest of England. One reason is staff sickness caused by the rapid spread of the new variant. Here at Kingston Hospital, they're having to juggle the staff they have on each shift.
In the last few weeks, we've had staff leaving places like theatres and going and helping in our emergency departments. I mean, luckily, this is something that's quite well rehearsed in this trust. We've also used some clerical and admin staff to come and support the staff on the wards.
And all this as COVID adds to the usual January pressures. This is the reality in many A&E units. Ambulance teams waiting to hand over patients, and that can cause delays getting back on the road and moving on to the next call-out. Pressures in social care mean patients like Jean, who are fit to leave, have to continue occupying hospital beds.
It's terribly frustrating. I mean, I could be at home now. Admitted I can't see to do what I used to do, but I'd be in my own environment. Yeah, life would be much more pleasant. But they are overstressed here and they're overworked.
All right, Derek?
Yeah, fine.
The NHS wants more patients like Derek treated away from hospitals. He had problems after an operation, but Newcastle Hospital's community team organised his care at home.
I can't begin to say how grateful I am with all that's been done. You know, well, it has. It's just transformed everything.
COVID hospital admissions are rising in all the UK's nations, but there are variations in England. In London, daily numbers are falling, but in the northwest and northeast, they're rising sharply.
We are still seeing rising hospitalisations, particularly with the case rate rising in older age groups. That is of concern. And I think we have to be honest, and when we look at the NHS, it will be a rocky few weeks ahead.
The public in general.
So how do the expert disease modellers see things now?
My hope is that we reach a peak in those in the next couple of weeks, and we are below where we were last January. But of course, there is that uncertainty regarding children returning to school and people returning to the workplace after the Christmas and New Year break, and what impact that will have ultimately on cases and hospital admissions.
So there's still uncertainty about what's ahead, though the NHS is sure that the strain on the front line won't ease off anytime soon. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, the government's latest coronavirus figures for the UK show there were 178,250 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. On average, 180,076 cases were reported per day in the last week. 18,454 people were in hospital with COVID as of yesterday. There were 229 deaths, that's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test, which means the average number of deaths over the past 7 days was 160. The total number of people who've died with COVID now stands at 149,744. On vaccinations, 90.2% of people aged 12 and over have now received the first dose, and 82.8% have been double jabbed. On average, 163,058 people received a booster every day in the last week, which means 61% have now had 3 vaccine doses. And the Welsh Government says those calling for COVID restrictions to be eased are factually wrong. And a warning, the storm of Omicron has arrived with astronomically high infection rates. Defending the decision to keep COVID rules in place, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said England's anti-restriction stance made it a global outlier as governments around the world took action to fight the latest wave of cases. Well, our Wales correspondent, Howell Griffith, is in Cardiff for us this evening. Howell, these are tough words from Mr. Drakeford.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering, Clive, that he is, of course, not just First Minister of Wales, but leader of the Welsh Labour Party. So never afraid of criticising Boris Johnson's decisions when they differ from his own. Now, he claimed that the UK government had failed to protect people in England and was politically paralysed in decisions over restrictions, making it different, of course, to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. Now, when the restrictions were introduced here on Boxing Day, that meant closing nightclubs, limiting numbers on people in pubs, bars and restaurants, playing major sporting fixtures behind closed doors. But since then, the COVID case rate in Wales has actually risen sharply and by some measures is now above England and Scotland. One thing's for certain, those measures are likely to stay for another fortnight, with Mr. Drakeford warning the peak isn't expected for some 14 days. And if they're extended even further, there's concern that Wales's home rugby internationals in February could potentially be moved over the border to England.
OK, Howell, thank you. Howell Griffith there in Cardiff. Novak Djokovic has thanked people around the world for their support as he awaits a decision on his deportation from Australia. Now, the men's world #1 tennis player remains in immigration detention in Melbourne ahead of the Australian Open after being denied entry on Wednesday. Government officials say he isn't being held captive and is free to leave any time. Meanwhile, it's emerged a second player, Renata Voráčová from the Czech Republic, has also had her Australian visa cancelled and is currently being held in the same hotel. Shama Khalil reports from Melbourne.
This is the immigration detention hotel where Novak Djokovic is being kept. Adnan Chopani has been here for 5 months now, after being moved from another facility.
I live in level 2 and Djokovic live in level 1. That is the food. We've been served every day by cantinas. We found a maggot and mold on a bread and we've been reporting it, but unfortunately there's no action been taken.
Outside the hotel, there was dancing and music, but also anger and frustration among Novak Djokovic's supporters. It's unclear if the tennis star will remain here until Monday, when his legal team will challenge the cancellation of his visa.
Novak Djokovic is waiting for a court decision on whether he'll be able to stay and compete in the Australian Open or be deported. Whatever happens, this has gone way beyond tennis. The world #1 is now at the center of a political and a diplomatic storm.
Djokovic arrived on Wednesday with an exemption granted by Tennis Australia and the state of Victoria. But the border forces revoked his visa, saying he did not meet the rules of entry. His mother, Diana, said on Thursday that he was being kept like a prisoner. Australia's Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews hit back, saying there was nothing stopping him from leaving.
Mr Djokovic is not being held captive in Australia. He is free to leave at any time that he chooses to do so, and Border Force will actually facilitate that.
The tennis star posted on Instagram thanking his fans around the world. Another player has now had her visa cancelled. Renata Vorachova from the Czech Republic is understood to be detained in the same hotel as Djokovic. The Australian Open is one of the biggest sporting events here, but it's turning into a big international embarrassment for the government. Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Melbourne.
It's just after 6:15, our top story this evening.
You will call me
And the
sir
actor
or
Sir
Mr.
Sidney Poitier, whose pioneering films in the 50s and 60s shone a light on racism and social prejudice, has died. He was 94. And coming up, the letter that reached its destination against all the odds.
Coming up in Sports Day on the BBC News Channel, we head to Cameroon to look ahead to the first major football tournament of the year, with the Africa Cup of Nations kicking off on Sunday, with the host taking on Burkina Faso.
A team of British cancer specialists says a new form of personalised treatment is producing promising results in adults with leukemia. Now, it involves reprogramming a patient's immune system to attack cancer cells. The teams at University College London and University College Hospital say it may offer hope for patients for whom other treatments have failed. Our medical editor Fergus Walsh has the full story.
Coming out of the deep freeze, a new frontier in cancer treatment. Phil has been living with leukemia for more than 20 years.
Feeling okay?
Fine, yeah.
Yeah.
Inside this bag are his own immune cells, which have been genetically engineered to fight his cancer. And now, drop by drop, are being infused back into his body at University College Hospital, London. All other cancer treatments have failed to stop his leukemia returning. CAR-T is his best hope.
It's a living drug inside me now. It's a medicine which lives in me, and it just replicates inside the bone marrow. Every time it sees a sort of cancer cell, zap. That's
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, yeah.
CAR-T stands for chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy. Part of the patient's own immune system, their T cells, are removed from their blood. In a laboratory, these cells are modified. A gene is added to enable them to recognize their own cancer. This army of T cells is multiplied and then infused back into the patient. A new protein on the surface of the T cells locks on to the cancer, earmarking it for destruction. CAR-T therapy is part of a revolution in cancer treatment, which harnesses the power of the patient's own immune system to tackle their disease. There is a long way to go, but increased understanding of the genetics of cancer is delivering more and more targeted therapies with better outcomes. CAR-T is already available on the NHS for leukemia patients up to the age of 25, but not for older adults because it's proved too toxic. Scientists at University College London have refined CAR-T to reduce side effects, and after more trials, hope it will be licensed for older patients.
It's absolutely transformative, probably the biggest breakthrough in the last 20 years in malignant blood cancers. It's just an absolute delight to be able to offer new therapies to these patients who otherwise, have no treatment options available to them.
I think it's called Watch and Wait.
Claire from Hampshire had CAR-T therapy 2 years ago after standard leukemia treatment failed.
As long as everything goes okay, the biopsies become less frequent.
She's still in remission.
I don't think I'd be here if I hadn't had CAR-T. I was very, very lucky that the trial was there at the time.
So if the CAR-T option hadn't been available, I would have had probably a finite amount of time left.
In years to come, CAR-T may be able to treat tumours in the brain, prostate and liver, giving more cancer patients like Claire and Phil a brighter future. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
The Attorney General says she's carefully considering whether to refer the Edward Colston statue case to the Court of Appeal, as she believes the verdict is causing confusion. 4 people were cleared of criminal damage at Bristol Crown Court on Wednesday. The statue of the 17th century slave trader was pulled down in 2020 and thrown into the River Avon during Black Lives Matter protests. The president of Kazakhstan has ordered his security forces to use lethal force on protesters without warning. Days of unrest and mass demonstrations began this week after a sudden rise in fuel prices. The authorities say dozens of people have been killed and hundreds injured. Russian troops have arrived to support the government, and the security forces say order has largely now been restored. From Kazakhstan's largest city, Almaty, our correspondent Abdul Rasulov has the very latest.
The army of Kazakhstan is standing guard here on the streets of Almaty. After days of violence and many protesters killed, the state's security forces seem to be back in control. And when we came close to them, the warning not to approach is very clear. Today the president was clear too. Any more unrest will be met with lethal force.
Terrorists continue to damage state and private property and use weapons against civilians. I have given the order to shoot to kill without warning.
President Tokayev portrays the protesters as terrorists who are sowing chaos. They say that their movement is peaceful and blame the authorities for provoking the violence. The unrest was triggered by a sharp rise in fuel prices, but this country's corrupt authoritarian regime is unpopular. These were the scenes on the streets yesterday. It's not clear how many people died. The authorities say dozens of protesters were killed. There's been violent clashes at night time too, here in the heart of Almaty.
Some of the biggest clashes took place here at the former presidential residence and the mayor's office. The buildings were burnt down, and you can see here all these cars were also set on fire. You can hear again the shots, but maybe it's the military and police officers are firing into the air to warn people not to approach the square, because they closed the square in order to prevent people from gathering.
Many people fear that the violence will drag on. Along with protests, many shops were looted. This 22-year-old man says that while he supports the demands of the protesters, he wants looters to be stopped. It's not clear yet if the violence is over or how much damage has been done to the authority of Kazakhstan's hardline leader. Abdul Rasulov, BBC News, Almaty.
The Labour MP Jack Dromey has died suddenly. He was 73. He was the Shadow Minister for Immigration and MP for Birmingham Erdington since 2010 and was married to Labour's Harriet Harman. Paying tribute, Sir Keir Starmer said he stood up for his constituents, and the former Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown also commended his work supporting others over 4 decades of public service. Mr Dromey had spoken in Parliament just yesterday about the resettlement of Afghan refugees.
This is why the Afghan citizens resettlement scheme and today's debate is so important. It is about standing by those who desperately need our support at a time when, dare I say it, our failure has helped to put them into an intolerable position. This is also about basic decency.
The Labour MP Jack Dromey, who's died at the age of 73. There are widespread calls for reform of the justice system to improve the rights of families bereaved after public tragedies like the Hillsborough disaster and the Grenfell Tower fire. Campaigners want what's being called a Hillsborough Law to allow publicly funded legal representation for bereaved families and public servants like the police to be compelled to tell the truth at all inquiries. Our North of England correspondent Judith Moritz has that story.
The Hillsborough families and survivors spent 30 years fighting for justice. Now their court days are behind them, but there are renewed calls for legal change.
We need to find those witnesses and prove that Kevin could have been saved.
This week, a drama about Hillsborough mum Anne Williams has given that momentum. Today, 2 former Prime Ministers joined the campaign for a Hillsborough Law.
And I've been struck in the case of Hillsborough, but in other cases too, at the way in which the state in its various forms acts to defend itself from blame. The very bodies that we expect to protect and support the public seek instead to protect themselves.
We need that Hillsborough Law now. A new legal duty of candour, and that means no cover-ups, no concealments, no closing of ranks, proper legal representation for families in the event of a public disaster.
One of the proposals is for victims to receive the same level of legal funding as the authorities they're up against, something the Hillsborough families were denied for years.
We're not rich people. We haven't got big fat pensions like the police get. They've got the money, but they got all the help. People like us had to go to the ordinary people and go around campaigning and trying to collect money to fight a cause. That was not our fault, no fault of our own.
Victims of attacks and disasters, including Grenfell, say they support the idea of a law which would force public officials to give full and truthful evidence to all forms of inquiry and investigation. This memorial to the victims of the Manchester Arena attack opened earlier this week. After the bombing, there was an independent review, which was followed by the ongoing public inquiry. But there's been criticism that some witnesses have given different versions of evidence to the 2 sets of legal proceedings. And campaigners for a Hillsborough Law say it would stop that kind of thing happening.
It is no longer acceptable for ranks to be closed, for victims to be blamed, for a huge effort to be made to create a false narrative. We just will not accept that anymore, and that is what the Hillsborough Law is all about changing.
The government says it will respond to recommendations, including a Hillsborough Law, in due course. It's the BBC's understanding that an announcement is expected later this year. Judith Moritz, BBC News.
A letter posted to a man in County Antrim with no surname or address on the envelope, just his first name and a 57-word biography, has amazingly managed to find its way to him. Our island correspondent Emma Vardy has that story.
Fergal lives across the road from the Spar. His ma and da used to own it.
No house number, no street name, a few things much more personal than that.
First thing I noticed was the amount of detail on the envelope and basically my biography. Moved to Waterfoot after he got married.
Despite nothing more than a short story and half a postcode, yesterday this letter found its way straight to Fergal Lynn.
I laughed so much right through it all, to playing guitar to, friends with the fella who owns the butchers in Waterfoot.
Fergal had taken to writing letters to people over lockdown as a way to brighten the gloom, but never expected such a strange reply.
The letter was from an old friend in Belfast, who perhaps could have found out his address, but thought this way was a little more fun.
We were talking about the pandemic, we were talking about mental health and the need to brighten the mood a bit.
Did she actually expect it to reach you?
I think she just took a punt.
Plays guitar and used to run discos in the parochial hall.
It just happened to be that Fergal's local postman was also a childhood friend.
We've had some strange addresses over the years, but this is the most bizarre of them all. The first line, Fergal, who used to live across from the Spar. The number of times we played in his front garden as wee boys, I knew right away who it was.
This could give other people ideas if they don't know an address.
Oh, that would be a nightmare.
And inside the letter, just a cheery hello and a recipe for coleslaw that Fergal had been asking about. But it meant much more than that.
There's just so much letters that we get these days. It's meaningless, it's financial, it's rates demand, and it's so nice to receive something so personal. Friends with the fella that runs the butchers in Waterfoot too. BT44, Northern Ireland.
So could letters make a comeback over email in future as something a lot more enjoyable? Well, we'll keep you posted. Emma Vardy, BBC News, Cushendall.
Time for a look at the weather now. Thomas has the details. Hi there, Thomas.
Hi there, Clive. And it's still quite wintry out there for some of us. Obviously, most of us have not seen any snow in the last few days, but the further north you are, I think, you know, got some pretty pictures of snowy scenes out there. But this is the headline for the next 24 hours. Frost tonight, but by tomorrow early morning, it's actually going to turn a lot milder. Now, notice where the blue is the frost this evening and early on through the nights. That frost is going to lift once this weather system piles in off the Atlantic. So this is the milder, wetter weather that's heading our way tomorrow. But ahead of it, where the skies are clear tonight, the temperatures are actually going to drop like a stone temporarily. So a little bit of iciness around across northern parts of the UK, maybe even in the south as well as the skies clear. So temperatures early in the night still below freezing, perhaps -1 or so, and there's certainly going to be some snow across the mountains and hills of the north. But look at that, by 4 o'clock in the morning, the temperature in Plymouth is 7, 3 degrees above freezing in Belfast. This is the milder Atlantic air within this weather system here. So tomorrow, the first half of the day is not going to be great. Outbreaks of rain, really quite heavy for a time, strong winds, and then later in the day it should brighten up a little bit with some showers, but the back edge of this rain could be a little bit further towards the west here, so we're not quite sure how quickly that rain is going to clear, but suffice to say, not a great day for many of us tomorrow. Sunday, a better day because we're in between weather systems. There'll be more sunshine around. The temperatures will, I think, continue to rise over the next few days as we see these weather systems coming in. And there's a hint that later next week, we could see the weather settling down as high pressure builds. So really a lot happening on the weather front over the next few days.
Sure. OK, Thomas, thank you. Thomas there. And that's it. I'll be back with the news at 10. Now, though, on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good evening.